I'm always curious about being only an honorary lecturer at UKZN, but an extraordinary senior lecturer at Northwest. But I mean, we can perhaps take that offline. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present. This presentation does not have a lot of slides at all. And I'd just like to pick up, Pascal, thank you very much for mentioning the paper upon which this is based, and particularly your comments about EU policy, because I must admit, when we drafted this paper, I certainly was, I suspect, mildly naive about the EU, the linkage, if you like, between EU climate policy and COVID policy, or the EU New Green Deal. And I thought that it was possibly something that I'm realizing that it's not quite yet. Let's come to that. The other thing I'd like to say is, as you are all aware, this paper, the link to this paper is provided in your program, and so I do not intend to go through the paper. I'd like to mention some very high-level issues and some interesting connectivity that didn't find its way into the paper because we didn't have enough space. Because I mean, it's a policy brief. It's intended deliberately to be short. If I may, Climate Legal, as Mike has very kindly said, is a specialist climate change and carbon markets legal consultancy. We've been very lucky to develop work in an area that we love. Couple of publications. The one thing that's causing me, well, it would be causing me grey hair if that was possible, is we are in the throes of finalizing a concise guide to the carbon tax under LexisNexis, which will come out hopefully in electronic form within the next couple of weeks. I thought I would put up this set of resources. The paper that I'm talking to is the very last bullet point on this slide. And I put this set of resources up because actually this paper, this policy brief, didn't appear out of the ether or out of a vacuum. For us, certainly, it's a logical extension of a range of things that we have been doing over time, starting with looking at carbon pricing approaches on the African continent linked to climate financing approaches on the African continent. And when you begin that sort of investigation at the moment, perhaps a logical place to start is, to what extent do African countries' nationally determined contributions, so NDCs under Paris, to what extent do they indicate an ambition on the part of an African jurisdiction to become involved or more involved with future carbon pricing? So that becomes a link to the sort of the opening statement of this paper, which I shall mention shortly. It's very much worth saying that the paper was funded, it was done under the auspices of the South African Institute for International Affairs, and we are very grateful for our association with SIRE, and the climate aspect, the climate wing is run by Alex Benkenstein. So my colleague Olivia Rumble wrote that very first sentence, which makes me a little bit envious, actually, because it's the kind of sentence I like to write. So in many senses, the COVID-19 pandemic is a climate change parable with similarities and differences, with lessons being drawn from how humanity responds to both. Now, the notion that there are responses to both of these issues almost implies that those responses are different. But the point made in the paper is that those responses are intimately connected with one another, and in fact, in some instances, are one and the same. So let me give you, from my perspective, a very interesting piece of research that didn't make its way into the paper. And it goes like this. At which point in the past has humanity experienced a similar diminution of economic activity as we are experiencing with COVID-19? And the two most recent instances are the 2008 economic crash and then the crash that occurred after 9/11. And so you can then ask yourself and say, all right, well, if we've been in a similar economic situation before, can we draw any lessons for how we responded to those situations? So the simple question is, well, did we try and move away from business as usual after the 2008 economic crash or after the 9/11 attacks? And the answer is no, we didn't. There was a diminution in economic activity, a concomitant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and immediately business as usual reasserted itself. We went back to increasing volumes of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So then the question is, well, COVID-19 is a new lesson. Surely we've learned now. Well, you would be surprised perhaps to know that in fact we haven't seemed to have learned. There are already plans afoot to increase and ramp up coal production in jurisdictions like China as we move towards a return to business as usual. I'm trying to avoid saying business as usual because the terminology we tried to move around within the paper was a post-COVID return to business as usual. So post-COVID as a modifier to the idea of business as usual. Why is this important in the context, say, of the international climate change legal regime? Well, COP26, which was supposed to occur at the end of this year, was the moment in time where we would see a ratcheting up, if you like, or a recommitment and an elevated commitment to taking climate action on the part of the parties to the Paris Agreement. I'm not talking about adaptation particularly for the moment, particularly in the context of mitigation. So it's really unfortunate that as a result of COVID-19, COP26 has been delayed into next year. Why? Well, because there's been quite a lot of argumentation that you've seen during the rounds that has effectively been based on the notion that a diminution of economic activity and consequently industrial scale greenhouse gases as a result of COVID means that we can take our foot off the climate change accelerator. And in fact, the contrary is true. If you go and look at the long-term temperature goal as set out in the Paris Agreement, and you look at the underlying science, we need during the course of this decade, so by 2030, we need year-on-year reductions, significant reductions, 7.2% approximately, year-on-year reductions of global greenhouse gas emissions in order by 2030 just to put us in a position where we might meet the long-term temperature goal, which is net zero emissions in the second part of the century. Now, the other thing that I realized quite early on in the process of drafting this paper was that statistics that we looked at 3 months before the finalization of the paper became rapidly outdated. So I'm not going to try and quote statistics. What I'm going to do rather is just read you the last 2 bullet points on the slide, because I really quite enjoy them, and they are a composite of ideas drawn through the research. So any argument that uses pandemic-related greenhouse gas emission reductions as the basis for arguing that COVID-19 will automatically accelerate a climate-friendly decoupling of the linkage between greenhouse gas emissions and economic outputs is misplaced. The science is telling us that there has been a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions as a result of COVID, but it is orders of magnitude smaller than is required by science, the science woven into the Paris Agreement. And so consequently, in order to sustain any COVID-driven climate mitigation gains, post-pandemic political governance must be deliberately aligned with an economically and socially just transition to a climate resilient future. What's amusing for me in a sense is we looked at COVID, we looked at a health pandemic, but we didn't step out of our comfort zone in the climate change context, because these things really are one and the same. I will end it there because I'd be very I'm very curious to engage with colleagues and to be involved in the discussion. But I encourage you to read the paper because it does a couple of things that I really enjoy. It makes what in some instances appear to be lateral leaps, linking climate change considerations with other governance and administrative issues and considerations that might not obviously be climate change. So let me give you a simple example. Is there a mitigation impact? Is there a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that can be achieved by the imposition of better health conditions? And the answer is yes. If you go into low-income housing and you retrofit the typical footprint of a low-income house, particularly in South Africa, if you make that house more healthy to live in, so you insulate the ceilings, you provide solar water heaters, for example, to provide hot and cold running water, you will have both a mitigation impact and a health impact, both of which will be positive. So allow me to leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.